Two concepts long prominent in the moral culture of the West are love and justice. One can imagine a society in which one or the other of these was absent. Indeed, one can imagine a society in which both of them were absent, a society in which nobody talked about love and nobody talked or thought in terms of justice. But in our society, many of us, not all of us, think and talk in terms of both love and justice. The reason for this is that we are the inheritors, we in our society are the inheritors of two comprehensive imperatives issued by the writers of antiquity. Two imperatives that employ these concepts. The imperative to do justice comes to us from both the Athens-Rome strand of our heritage and the Jerusalem strand. Do justice, said the prophet Micah in a well-known passage. And the ancient Roman jurist Ulpian said that we are to render to each person what is his or her right. The imperative to love comes to us only from the Jerusalem strand. Love your neighbor as yourself, even if that neighbor is an enemy. Now, these two imperatives, these two grand comprehensive imperatives, do justice and love your neighbor as yourself, do not reveal on their face how they're related to each other. And that's why it is that over and over the question has been raised in the writings of the West, by philosophers, by theologians, by poets and novelists. How are these two imperatives related to each other? Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is about that. What do love and justice have to do with each other? The fact that it's only in our Jerusalem heritage that both of these imperatives are to be found carries the implication that the topic of love and justice was not discussed by the ancient Greek and Roman writers. The ancient Stoic Seneca wrote a small book entitled in Latin De Clementia. And clemency, as used in present-day English, refers to foregoing the appropriate punishment for some crime, out of mercy for the offender or his family, out of concern for the common good, or something like that. And so, given the title of this little treatise, one would expect Seneca's topic to be that particular aspect of the relation between love and justice. But it turns out that that's not his topic. By clementia, in Latin, by clementia, Seneca did not mean foregoing the appropriate punishment of some wrongdoer out of mercy. He meant choosing the lesser of two punishments specified in the law for some crime. Pervasive in the literature on love and justice in the West is the theme of tension or conflict. Sometimes this theme takes the form of writers arguing that it's impossible to follow the two imperatives simultaneously, that they are inherently conflictual. The idea is that to act out of love is perforce not to act as one does because justice requires it, or to act as one does because justice requires it is perforce not to act out of love. Inherently conflictual. At other times, the theme of justice or conflict takes the weaker form of writers arguing that following the love imperative will sometimes, not always, wreak injustice, or that following the justice imperative will sometimes, not always, be unloving. The examples of love sometimes wreaking injustice fall, for the most part, into three types. First, generosity is sometimes dispensed in such a way that it's unjust. This is the issue posed by Jesus' parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Secondly, benevolent paternalism is sometimes exercised in such a way that it's unjust. And third, a persistent charge in the literature against forgiveness, pardon, amnesty, commutation of sentence, and the like, is that in foregoing or diminishing punishment of the wrongdoer, justice is somehow violated. That charge is at the center of the swirling controversies about truth and reconciliation commissions of the last 30 or 40 years. And it's also the issue that St. Anselm raised when he discussed the relation between God's love and God's justice in his book Proslogion. Addressing God, Anselm asks, how do you spare the wicked if you are all just and supremely just? How is forgiveness compatible with justice? Now, there are both different kinds of justice and different kinds of love. So a question that comes to mind, once one has noted the theme of tension between love and justice, is what kind of justice and what kind of love do those writers have in mind who see tension between the two, be it that inherent tension or that occasional tension? The major distinction within the field of justice has traditionally been marked by distinguishing between distributive and so-called commutative justice on the one hand, and retributive justice on the other hand. Now, I happen to think that that's an inept way, an inadequate way of marking the distinction. And I prefer to speak of primary justice and reactive justice. Primary justice is the justice present in society insofar as we treat each other as we have a right to be treated. And such justice certainly includes distributive justice, and it certainly includes so-called commutative justice, justice in exchanges. But I think it goes beyond those. Rape strikes me as not falling under either distributive or commutative justice. I think it's gross to regard it as maldistribution or a failure of contract. But it's certainly a case of injustice. And reactive justice, what I call reactive justice, consists then of responding justly to breakdowns in primary justice, responding justly, if you will, to injustice. And it will often take the form of retribution, or retributive punishment. But here too it includes more than that. If you treat me unjustly, a just reaction on my part is anger. But to be angry at you is not to impose retributive punishment on you. You might not even be aware of my being angry at you, so it's no hard treatment at all. So back to our question. What kind of justice is thought to be in tension or conflict with love, primary or reactive? I think the answer is all kinds. Sometimes the justice that a writer has in mind is primary justice. Sometimes it's reactive justice. And within primary justice, sometimes it's distributive justice, sometimes it's commutative, and sometimes it's a third form. The situation with respect to the concept of love being employed in these discussions about tension and conflict is different. Among the various things that we English-speaking people call love is attraction. The love that consists of being drawn or attracted to something or somebody on account of its worth or its excellence. As when one says, I love Beethoven's late string quartets, love of attraction. A classic discussion of such love is in Plato's Dialogue Symposium. Now, another thing that our English word love refers to is love as gratuitous benevolence, generosity, seeking to advance the well-being of another as an end in itself, paying no attention to whether or not justice requires it. Now, to the best of my knowledge, whenever a writer talks about the tension or conflict between love and justice, it's always love as gratuitous benevolence, generosity, that they have in mind. Writers seldom say that that's what they have in mind by love. They just talk about love. But when one looks closely at what they say, I think it always becomes apparent that it really is love as generosity, as gratuitous benevolence that they're thinking about. I don't know, it may be that justice also sometimes comes into real or apparent conflict with love as attraction. But if so, I don't know of any case in which it is love as attraction that the writer has in mind when he or she talks about real or apparent conflict between love and justice. Always it's love as benevolence. Love is gratuitous generosity. Okay. Now, cases of real or apparent conflict between justice and benevolence, I think, are often ethically important and intellectually intriguing, as are many of the proposals that people have proposed for resolving the conflict. I think it's really worth considering, for example, is it really true that forgiveness undermines justice? That's an important issue. But on this occasion, I'm going to set off to the side all such cases of real or apparent conflict so as to raise this prior question. If love is gratuitous benevolence or generosity, so often yields real or apparent conflict with justice, forcing us to choose between love and justice, or to analyze the case in such a way that the apparent conflict disappears. May it be that we are misinterpreting our Jewish and Christian inheritance. May it be that when Jesus issued the imperative to love our neighbors as ourselves, it was not gratuitous benevolence that he had in mind, but some other form of love. And may it be that justice and this other form of love are not in tension with each other. May it even be that between them there is some deep form of unity. May it be that we should rethink our understanding of love, and some of us probably rethink our understanding of justice. That's the idea I'd like to explore in this talk. Now, the Greek word that the New Testament writers use to report Jesus' injunction to love one's neighbor as oneself is agape, A-G-A-P-E, agape. The view that what Jesus meant by agape was gratuitous self-sacrificing benevolence or generosity was never more thoroughly developed than by certain members of the so-called agapist, from agape of course, agapist movement in the late 19th and 20th century Protestant ethics. In particular by the Danish writer Søren Kierkegaard in his Works of Love, and by Anders Nygren in his Agape and Eros. Nygren was a Swedish Lutheran bishop who published Agape and Eros in installments in the early 1930s. Kierkegaard is writing in the mid-1900s. Kierkegaard, of those two, Kierkegaard was undoubtedly the more profound. But not only was Nygren the more influential, he also devoted a good deal more attention to the relation between love and justice than Kierkegaard did. So what I'd like to do now is take a brief look at what Nygren had to say about love and justice. Nygren, N-Y-G-R-E-N. This look at Nygren will prove to be a good way of identifying some of the fundamental issues that I think you and I have to face. Nygren saw three great motifs, as he called them, locked in a struggle for dominance in Western thought. One motif is that of eros, E-R-O-S, eros being love as attraction. I've already talked about that. The motif of eros is dominant in the Platonic tradition. And as I said, it's the topic in Plato's Symposium. Nygren argues, I think it's implausible, that eros is at bottom a form of self-love. It just seems to me that when I say I love the late Beethoven string quartets, that's not a form of self-love, it's love of the quartets, it's not love of me, but that was just a parenthesis. A second motif is that of Nygren. A second motif is that of nomos, N-O-M-O-S. These are all Greek words. Law. Nygren associates nomos, law, with justice, and he holds that the motif of nomos is dominant in the Old Testament. The third great motif in Western thought is agape, understood then as self-sacrificial, gratuitous benevolence that pays no attention to what justice requires. The motif of agape, so Nygren argues, is dominant in the New Testament. It's the love that Jesus attributes to God and that Jesus enjoins on us in the second love command. Nygren did not hesitate to affirm the implications of this scheme, including the implication that in the New Testament, the Old Testament motif of justice has been supplanted by the New Testament motif of agapic love. He forthrightly said, the Old Testament God is a God of justice, the New Testament God is a God of love. Jesus, and I'm going to be quoting some passages here without telling you each time when I'm quoting. Jesus, says Nygren, enters into fellowship with those who are not worthy of it. His doing so is directed against every attempt to regulate fellowship with God by the principle of justice. That Jesus should take lost sinners to himself was bound to appear not only to the Pharisees, but to anyone brought up and rooted in Jewish legal righteousness as a violation of the order established by God himself and guaranteed by his justice. For them, for the Jews, It was a violation not only of the human, but above all of the divine order of justice, and therefore of God's majesty. I trust the point comes through. The New Testament is a repudiation of the Old Testament God of justice. Neagren's point is unmistakable. The agapic love displayed and enjoined by Jesus does not incorporate or supplement justice. It supersedes it. Quotation, motivated justice must give place to unmotivated love. We are not to love the neighbor agapically in addition to treating her as justice requires. We are to love her agapically instead of treating her as justice requires. And why did Neagren see love as supplanting justice in the New Testament? Why not love and justice? Neagren's answer to this question was admirably clear. He held that the paradigmatic New Testament example of God's love, the example that should shape all our thinking, both about God's love and about our love of the neighbor, the paradigm example is God's forgiving and covenanting love of the sinner. And then he said, God's forgiveness is not a case of doing what justice requires. The wrongdoer cannot claim that justice requires that God forgive. And Neagren concluded from this that the love that Jesus and the New Testament writers had in mind expels any note whatsoever of doing what justice requires. New Testament love is blind to justice and injustice. New Testament love is an utterly gratuitous, self-sacrificing concern for the well-being of the other. Here's how the German theologian Emil Brunner, part of the same movement, put the point in his book, Justice and the Social Order. Love, he said, said Brunner, love does not render to the other what is his due, what belongs to him by right, but gives of its own, gives precisely that to which the other has no right. And this all makes sense if you're getting baffled, but keep forgiveness in mind as the paradigm example of love, okay? View it all through the lens of forgiveness. Neagren took the argument a step further. In its blindness to justice and injustice, agapic love may perpetrate injustice. Neagren regarded that as the point of Jesus' parable of the laborers in the vineyard. The landlord in Neagren's interpretation acknowledges that when he paid the latecomers the same amount as those who worked all day in the heat, he was being unfair and unjust to the early workers. But on Neagren's interpretation, the landowner dismisses their complaint with the remark, hey, look, I've got a right to be generous as I wish. Neagren drew the lesson that we must expect that agapic love, gratuitous self-giving generosity, will sometimes wreak injustice. No matter. The follower of Jesus is called to remain faithful to love and say goodbye to justice if that proves necessary. After Neagren, the figure in the modern-day agapist tradition who thought most deeply about the relation of New Testament love to justice was the American theologian Reynold Niebuhr. Niebuhr joined Neagren in interpreting New Testament love as gratuitous, self-giving generosity that pays no attention to what justice requires. And he agreed with Neagren that such love might perpetrate injustice. But Niebuhr thought that Neagren's response to the possibility of conflict was socially and politically deeply naive. Stick with love, says Neagren. Niebuhr thought that as a social and political possibility, policy, that would be a calamity. Try responding to Hitler once with agapic love. A major part of Niebuhr's lifelong opposition to liberal American Christianity was his opposition to what he saw, rightly or wrongly, as its naive assumption that if Christians just loved enough, people would respond in kind and they'd also start loving and love would rule the world. Grossly naive, Niebuhr thought. In this present age, we must expect that love will not evoke love. but will instead both perpetrate and abet injustice, and will get run over. The life of Jesus ended on the cross. So what to do? Niebuhr thought that it was deeply irresponsible to be content with abetting or perpetrating injustice. Yet as a Christian theologian, he couldn't give up on love. And so his solution was to argue that justices for this present fallen world, of what he called conflicting interests, whereas agapic love is for the eschaton of what he called frictionless harmony. To this he added the qualification that here and now and then, in small-scale situations like families, and so forth, where conflict is absent, here and there, in such situations, agapic love can be practiced without aiding and abetting injustice. Okay, two examples of the modern day, of a movement within modern day agapism. I judge that Niguin's line of thought is untenable, and Niebuhr's as well, for slightly different reasons. On this occasion, let me focus on Niguin. First, Niguin's line of thought is exegetically untenable. Justice is not supplanted by love in the New Testament. Even a casual reading of the New Testament will reveal that justice, rather than being supplanted in the New Testament, is at the heart of the New Testament. I argue this point in detail in my book, Justice, Rights, and Wrongs, and here's not the place to repeat the argument. Let me instead confine myself to noting that Niguin has misinterpreted the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. His interpretation being his major textual basis for saying that New Testament love may conflict with justice, and that when they do, the Christian should stick with love and say goodbye to justice. The landowner in the parable does not say to the complaining all-day workers what Niguin interprets him as saying. Here's what Niguin interprets him as saying. It's true that I've treated you unjustly, but don't I have a right to dispense my generosity as I please? Let me quote what the landowner does in fact say. Quote, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? I choose to give to these last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Friend, I do you no wrong." The Greek word translated there as wrong is adikos, the dikstem words being the standard words for justice and so forth, and a being the negative. I am doing you no wrong. I'm not treating you unjustly. That's what the landowner says to the complainers. So rather than agreeing with the complainers that he's treated them unjustly, but then saying he's got a right to do that, that's okay, the landowner is contesting their understanding of justice and injustice. Not only is Niguin's line of thought exegetically untenable, it's also systematically incoherent. We are always to think of love on the model of God's forgiveness of the sinner, says Niguin and Niebuhr and so forth as well. But just think for a moment about forgiveness, the nature of forgiveness. One cannot just spread forgiveness here and there. One can only forgive someone if he has wronged one, and only for the wrong he has done one. But to wrong somebody is to treat that person unjustly, to deprive him of what he's got a right to. So forgiveness cannot be blind to justice and injustice. You have to know that you were treated unjustly. Forgiveness presupposes attentiveness to issues of justice and injustice. The reply might be forthcoming that though it's true that forgiveness cannot just be inattentive to issues of justice and injustice, nonetheless it remains the case that forgiveness isn't motivated by what justice requires. And I think that's true. But now take note of another and deeper incoherence in Niguin's claim that it's acceptable to perpetrate injustice out of agapic love. If in loving somebody agapically I treat him unjustly, if I do, then I violate his right not to be so treated. I wrong him. And if he has a right to not being so treated by me, then I ought not to treat him that way. In general, it's the case that if somebody has a right with respect to me to my not treating them that way, then I've got a correlative obligation to not treat him that way. And if I've got an obligation to not treat him that way, then I'm not permitted to treat him that way. Negrin's position implies that I'm sometimes permitted to do out of love what I ought not to do. And that just makes no sense. If I ought not to do it, then I shouldn't do it. I'm not permitted to do it. Enough of that. Let's now back up. And rather than going along with the claim of Kierkegaard, Negrin, Brunner, Niebuhr, lots of others, that what Jesus meant by agape was justice-blind, gratuitous, self-sacrificial benevolence, let's look for clues in the biblical text as to what Jesus might in fact have meant. All three of the synoptic gospels report the episode in which Jesus presented the two love commands. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all report the episode. The episode is described ever so slightly differently in the three accounts. In their report of the two commands themselves, there are only slight rhetorical differences, with these two exceptions. Mark reports Jesus as introducing the first command with the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And Matthew, alone of the three, reports Jesus as saying that the second command is like the first one. So consider the two commands. The first says that we are to love God with our whole being. Now, Negrin, bless his rigor and consistency, Negrin saw this as posing a difficulty for his interpretation of love, New Testament love, agape, as gratuitous benevolence. Treating God with gratuitous benevolence didn't seem possible to Negrin. So, as I say, with the courage of his convictions, he concluded that Jesus and the New Testament writers were speaking rather loosely when they talked about loving God. What Jesus and Paul should have said, if they were speaking strictly, is that we are to have faith in God. In the first command, Jesus was enjoining us to have faith in God with our whole being. Now, I would have thought that at that point you should back up and wonder whether you'd given the right interpretation of agape. But in any case, what are we then to make of Jesus' statement in Matthew that the second command is like the first one? Given Negrin's interpretation of the first command is about faith and the second is about love. Given his interpretation, the second is quite unlike the first. Faith is not the same as love, and Negrin certainly didn't think it was. I'm not aware that Negrin anywhere addresses this, I think, obvious problem. Now consider the second command, love your neighbor as yourself. The rhetorical structure of this command is the familiar just as, so also. Just as you love yourself, so also love your neighbor. You love yourself, right? Love your neighbor as well. The second command presupposes the legitimacy of self-love, and then enjoins us to not only love ourselves, but love our neighbors as well. But love of self is obviously not self-sacrificial, gratuitous benevolence. Karl Barth often described agape as being for the other, but love of oneself is not being for the other. And I take it that Jesus is presupposing the legitimacy of love of oneself. In this case, Negrin does not resort to saying that Jesus must have been speaking loosely. Instead, he emphatically declares in a number of passages that Christianity is opposed to all forms of self-love. I'm not aware of any place in which he asks how that position can be squared with the fact that the second command, so far as I can see, presupposes the legitimacy of self-love. But now for the point that's the most important one for my purposes here tonight. The two love commands are not just statements of the essence or the heart of Torah, the law. They are quotations from the Old Testament Torah. The first love command is a quotation from Deuteronomy 6, and the second is a quotation from Leviticus 19. And the thought comes to mind, or at least came to my mind, that if we look at the context in which these two commands occur in the Torah, that might illuminate their meaning in the Torah, right? Context doesn't always illuminate meaning, but sometimes it does. Fairly often it does. Suppose that in this case, looking at their context in the Torah illuminates the meaning of these two commands in the Torah. Then I submit that it would have been likely that Jesus and his interrogators understood the commands with the same meaning that they had in the Torah. He might have understood them differently, but I think the burden of proof would be on the person who says, no, Jesus and his interrogators understood it quite differently from how it was understood in Leviticus. So on this occasion, let's confine ourselves to looking at the context in which the second command occurs in the Torah, Leviticus 19. The situation is Moses delivering God's law code to Israel. The whole context extends over about 3 chapters. You don't want me to read 3 chapters from Leviticus tonight. And it's going to be plenty sufficient for our purposes to quote, I think I've got the 4 preceding verses. You'll catch the context. God speaking through Moses. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in justice shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go up and down as a slanderer against your people, and you shall not stand forth against the life of your neighbor. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with your neighbor, lest you bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear any grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord your God. You saw what we have here, a number of more or less detailed injunctions, concluding with the love command. A question that comes to mind is whether that final command, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, should be interpreted as just one among many, on the same status as the 5 or 6 others that I read and the 32 others that precede. That's obviously not how Jesus and his interrogators regarded it. For them, it was the heart of Torah, not just one among others. And that's not how the Jewish tradition to this day understands it. The love command is understood as the generalized summation of everything that preceded. We are to read it as if it had this preface. In short, love your neighbor as yourself. Summary. And now for the point relevant to our present concerns. Did you notice that in this passage from Leviticus, love is not pitted against justice? To the contrary, treating one's neighbor justly is cited as among various ways of loving one's neighbor. Justice is cited as an example of love. My conclusion is that the love that Jesus enjoins on us for our neighbors is not to be understood as sheer gratuitous benevolence that pays no attention to whether or not it wreaks injustice. We have to rethink love so that it incorporates justice. It's not the whole of justice. We have to understand love in such a way that treating the neighbor justly is an example of loving the neighbor. And how do we do that? Well, begin with this question. Why is it that gratuitous benevolence sometimes wreaks injustice? What does love as benevolence, sheer benevolence, not take account of in such a case? To answer that question, I must ever so briefly explain how I understand justice. Here goes. I hold that justice is grounded in rights. Justice is present in society insofar as the individual and social members of society enjoy what they have a right to. And in turn, I hold that to understand what a right is, we must distinguish between how well or poorly a person's life is going, his well-being, and on the other hand, the worth or value of that person himself or herself. A truly admirable person may find that his life is going poorly, right? Those are the Jobs of the world. Conversely, a person whose life is going very nicely might not be an admirable person. And this gives rise to the ancient complaint. Why do the wicked prosper? That just presupposes the distinction between how well your life is going and how admirable you yourself are. So rights, as I understand them, are an interweaving of these two phenomena. The phenomenon of how well or poorly your life is going, your well-being, and the phenomenon of your own worth, dignity. Specifically, I think it comes to this. One has a right to the life good of being treated a certain way, just in case if you weren't treated that way, you would not be paid due respect for your worth, your dignity. In slightly different words, to deprive a person of his right to the life good of being treated a certain way is to treat that person with under-respect. An ethical framework, such as classical utilitarianism, that works only with the idea of life goods, and not also with the idea of the worth of persons, cannot, in my view, give an account of rights, and hence not an account of justice. So here then is my suggestion as to how the love that Jesus attributes to God and enjoins on us should be understood. Such love for the other person, or for oneself, seeks to advance the good, the well-being of the other person, the life of the other person. Seeks to advance the good of the other person. But the good of oneself or the other has two dimensions. The dimensions of well-being, of how well that person's life is going, and the dimension of respect for the person's worth. And I suggest that love attends to both of those, not just to how well the person's life is going, but also to whether the person is being paid due respect for their worth. Love does indeed seek to promote the well-being of people, but love also sees to it that the worth of the person is honored, that she's paid due respect. Now, I come to think that our English word care is commonly used to express exactly that double understanding of love. Using care here not in the sense of caring for a patient, but caring about somebody, when you care about somebody. When you care about somebody, when one cares about somebody, one both seeks to advance how well their life is going, and one also seeks to ensure that they're treated with due respect, that they're not humiliated, demeaned, and so forth. Love that seeks to promote somebody's well-being, but at the cost of wronging that person, demeaning them, may be an exemplary case of benevolence, sheer benevolence, but it's a malformed instance of care. So I suggest that the love that Jesus enjoined on us is not love as self-sacrificial, gratuitous benevolence that pays no attention to justice and injustice. The love that Jesus enjoined on us is care. Love that seeks both to advance the well-being of the other person, the neighbor, and sees to it that the neighbor is treated with respect. Many lines of investigation now beg for attention. For one thing, we want to go back to look once again at those cases of tension that I mentioned at the beginning. Unjust paternalism, unjust distribution of goods, and so forth. Rather than analyzing them as cases of conflict between justice on the one hand and love as benevolence on the other, we'll now analyze them as cases of malformed care. Care which isn't paying due attention to that dimension of respect. And the practical goal of our analysis would be to see if we can form some generalizations as to how to prevent love as care from being malformed in such a way as to wreak injustice. That's for another day. Let me close by restating my main point. I think we must rethink love, and if necessary, also rethink justice, so that we no longer think of love and justice as in tension with each other. When love is well-formed care, there's no conflict. Care incorporates justice. Care often goes beyond what justice requires. Justice by no means exhausts care, don't get me wrong. That's important. But well-formed care always does at least what justice requires. Love and justice, not love and justice against each other. Thanks.